The story begins in silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of something, or someone, deliberately hidden. For centuries, the Venezuelan people had turned to the Virgin Mary as their mother and protector. In no other title did this devotion shine more intensely than in Our Lady of Coromoto, venerated as the patroness of the nation. Her image, rooted in a 17th century apparition to an indigenous chief, had accompanied Venezuela through wars, dictatorships, economic booms, and deep crises. She was part of the country's soul. And yet, in the heart of Caracas, one particular Marian image had been absent from public view for 11 long years. The decision had not come in a single spectacular decree. It happened, as so many things do in times of tension, slowly and quietly. Under the pretext of security, public order, and avoiding agitations, public religious processions diminished. Then, outdoor Marian statues in some areas were removed for their own protection. Finally, one of the most beloved images of the Virgin in the capital was placed in a side chapel, then in a sacristy, and eventually behind a locked door. No official announcement declared that the Virgin had been banned. But in practice, she had disappeared from the streets. In the beginning, older parishioners protested. They asked why the processions no longer passed through their neighborhoods, why the great Marian feast days now felt discreet, almost hidden. They were met with vague answers. These were difficult times, there were security risks, it was better not to provoke anyone. And so, little by little, the mother who had once been carried proudly through the avenues was confined to the shadows. Yet something unexpected happened. When Mary vanished from the public squares, she multiplied in living rooms. In small apartments and humble houses, families set up simple home altars, a printed image taped to a wall, a small plastic statue bought from a street vendor years earlier, a candle in a glass jar, a rosary hanging from a nail. Every grandmother seemed to become a catechist again. Every kitchen table became a place of quiet resistance, where the Hail Mary was whispered over and over, even as the economy collapsed and the future became uncertain. Children who had never seen a large procession with banners and music grew up hearing stories about them. They used to carry her through the streets, the elders would say. There were flowers everywhere, and people sang all night. These children had to imagine the scene. For them, the great Marian feasts were not processions, but crowded living rooms, neighbors gathered around a cheap statue, sharing the little food they had. In these years, the Venezuelan crisis deepened. Shelves in supermarkets stayed empty. Hospitals lacked basic medicine. Millions left the country, walking across borders, carrying only a backpack and a rosary. Those who remained clung even more tightly to their faith. Parish priests celebrated masses with almost nothing, sometimes without electricity, sometimes with just a handful of candles on the altar. And always, somewhere nearby, there was an image of Mary watching over her suffering children. One particular parish in Caracas kept a secret known only to a few. Behind the sacristy door, wrapped carefully in cloth and protected from dust, stood a life-size statue of the Virgin Mary that had once been the center of great processions. Her face was serene, her hands gently joined in prayer, her eyes slightly lowered in compassion. She had seen crowds sing, cry, and kneel at her feet. For 11 years now, she had stood in almost complete darkness. From time to time, the parish priest would enter the room, close the door softly behind him, and stand in silence before the hidden statue. He would bring the intentions of his people, the mother who had no medicine for her child, the young man thinking of emigrating, the old man who felt abandoned, the teenager losing hope. He would say simply, "Mother, they still need you. Even if they cannot see you, do not leave them." Outside, the political tensions intensified year after year. News of accusations, sanctions, and international pressure filled radios and phones. People argued about leaders, about ideologies, about who was guilty or innocent. But in the invisible space of prayer, another reality was quietly being woven. A people, wounded but not broken, learning to live its Marian faith underground. Some began to say, half joking and half serious, that the Virgin herself had chosen to be hidden, as if in a long holy Saturday. A time of silence before a great intervention. A pause before something no one could yet imagine. The years passed. Children became teenagers. Teenagers became adults. A whole generation grew up without ever seeing that great statue of Mary carried into the streets. For them, the idea that once long ago Our Lady walked through Caracas sounded almost like a legend. And yet, in the heart of that same city, the hidden image remained, waiting behind a door that very few people opened. What no one knew was that the day when she would return to the eyes of the people would coincide with a night of unprecedented turmoil. A night when the political story of a man would collide, mysteriously, with the spiritual story of a mother. And what would happen to that man and to that country, in those hours, would indeed shock the world. While the hidden statue waited in darkness, the country outside descended into one of the deepest crises in its modern history. Venezuela had once been known as a wealthy oil nation, a land of opportunity in Latin America. Now, year after year, headlines spoke of something very different. Hyperinflation, empty supermarket shelves, hospitals without basic supplies, and an exodus of millions of citizens crossing borders on foot, searching for dignity and survival in neighboring countries. In the midst of this, faith did not disappear. It changed form. Parish priests noticed a strange paradox. On the one hand, fewer people could attend large public celebrations. Transport was expensive, streets were unsafe at night, and many had to spend hours in line just to buy bread or gasoline. On the other hand, those who did come to church came with a depth of prayer that was difficult to describe. Their faith was no longer decorative or cultural. It had become a matter of survival. In confessionals and counseling rooms, people spoke of fear, exhaustion, and anger. But again and again, they also spoke of Mary. A mother would say, "I don't know how we will eat next week. But every night I light a candle for Our Lady and ask her to help me feed my children one more day." An older man, whose pension had lost almost all value, would whisper, "When I feel despair, I take my rosary and remember that she stood at the foot of the cross. If she didn't abandon Jesus then, she will not abandon us now." The country's Marian shrines, especially the sanctuary of Our Lady of Coromoto, became quiet centers of spiritual gravity. Even if they could not travel there physically, many Venezuelans turned towards Guanare in their hearts when they prayed. They knew the story: an indigenous chief, overwhelmed by change, who saw the Virgin appear and invite him to receive the faith. Now, they felt like that chief, surrounded by forces beyond their control, desperate for a sign that God had not forgotten them. In cities like Caracas, Maracaibo, and Valencia, the official religious calendar continued, but with a noticeable difference. Where once there had been large public processions, now there were more modest indoor celebrations. Where once banners had filled the streets, now families filled parish halls with food donations, clothes, and medicine to be shared with those in greatest need. It was as if Mary, pushed out of the public square, had moved into the hidden places: the sick room, the soup kitchen, the long line outside a bakery. The rosary became a kind of underground network of hope, linking house to house, barrio to barrio, and even country to country as Venezuelan migrants carried their faith abroad. Those who had emigrated sent back photos of small Marian altars in foreign cities, a tiny statue of Our Lady of Coromoto on a rented shelf in Lima, a printed prayer card taped to a refrigerator in Bogota, a candle burning in a cramped apartment in Miami. Far from home, many rediscovered just how deeply the figure of Mary was woven into their identity as Venezuelans. Inside the country, trust in institutions eroded more each year. Political speeches changed, slogans changed, alliances shifted. But the simple prayer, "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death," remained the same, in every kitchen and every crowded bus. In this atmosphere, rumors began to circulate from time to time. Someone would mention a small chapel where a Marian image seemed to have wept. Someone else would talk about a faint smell of roses during a late-night mass, with no flowers in sight. A few would speak quietly of healings that doctors could not fully explain. The official church was prudent, as always. Priests reminded the faithful not to base their faith on extraordinary signs, but on the gospel, the sacraments, and daily charity. At the same time, they did not deny the possibility that, in times of great suffering, heaven might choose to comfort a people in ways that touched their senses as well as their hearts. For many Venezuelan Catholics, these small stories, whether confirmed or not, functioned like flickers of light in a very long tunnel. They did not remove the pain of the crisis. They did not solve the shortages or the political conflicts. But they whispered a different message beneath the noise of the news. You are not alone. Your mother sees you. All the while, the hidden statue in Caracas remained in storage, wrapped and protected, as if she too were waiting for the right moment to step back into the story. The parish priest, who had watched his congregation age and shrink, sometimes wondered if the day would ever come when she would again stand in the center of the church, visible to all. He did not know that forces far beyond his parish were already in motion. Outside Venezuela's borders, accusations, investigations, and diplomatic tensions multiplied. Powerful governments exchanged statements, imposed sanctions, and calculated strategies. Intelligence agencies gathered information in silence. Journalists pieced together fragments of a much larger puzzle, trying to understand what might be coming. The faithful in the pews did not know about classified reports or secret meetings. They knew only that life was growing harder, that many of their relatives had left, and that their future seemed to rest on decisions made in distant rooms they would never see. But in the logic of faith, there is always more happening than the eye can perceive. While political plans were being drawn in offices around the world, and while economic indicators continued their downward spiral, a quiet spiritual preparation was taking place in living rooms filled with rosaries, in parishes that refused to close their doors, and in the silent presence of a hidden Marian statue in Caracas. Soon, the storyline of power, of presidents, operations, and international accusations, would suddenly collide with this hidden storyline of prayer. When that collision finally came, it would not only alter the destiny of a single leader. It would awaken, in a dramatic way, the Marian heart of an entire nation. As the crisis deepened and years of uncertainty piled one upon another, something subtle began to change in the spiritual atmosphere of Venezuela. It did not start with headlines or official declarations. It began with whispers. In a small parish on the outskirts of Maracaibo, a few parishioners quietly told their priest that the eyes of a statue of the Virgin seemed different. One evening, after a late Mass, a woman lingered in prayer and thought she saw a trace of moisture on the statue's cheeks. She said nothing at first, afraid of being dismissed as emotional or superstitious. The next day, another parishioner mentioned the same thing. Then another. The priest, a cautious man by temperament, approached the image alone. He examined it carefully. He checked the ceiling for leaks, felt the wall for dampness, and looked for any sign of condensation or damage. Finding nothing obvious, he wiped the statue gently. For a few days, the phenomenon did not repeat. Then, during a quiet weekday Mass, a faint line of moisture appeared once more, starting from the statue's eyes and running down its face. He did not make dramatic announcements from the pulpit. Instead, he notified his bishop, who advised prudence. The message was simple: continue to pray, do not draw attention to it, and observe carefully. Faith cannot be built on tears, only on Christ. But if there is consolation in these signs, receive it humbly. Around the same time, in another region of the country, a different kind of report began to circulate. In a small chapel dedicated to Our Lady, people attending an evening rosary started to notice a fragrance in the air. It did not smell like incense or the mustiness of old wood. It was the distinct scent of fresh roses, strong and sweet, but there were no flowers in the sanctuary that night. At first, a few people thought it might be perfume from someone in the pews. But when the fragrance returned on multiple evenings, always during the rosary, curiosity grew. The chapel had no floral decorations and no nearby gardens in bloom. The scent would appear suddenly and disappear just as quickly, leaving behind a strange mix of awe and peace. More stories emerged from different corners of the country. Never in a sensational way, never with cameras or loud declarations. Always in the same, almost embarrassed tone. "I don't know how to explain it, Father, but something happened in the church last night." In normal times, these scattered accounts might have been ignored. People would have moved on quickly, distracted by busy schedules and comfortable routines. But these were not normal times. A people stripped of many earthly securities was acutely sensitive to any hint of heaven's nearness. For some, these whispers of signs were like a pulse check on their faith. They did not change doctrine, did not remove suffering, did not provide instant solutions. But they stirred a question deep in the hearts of many Venezuelans. Is Mary preparing us for something? Meanwhile, the hidden statue in Caracas remained out of sight, wrapped and motionless in its storage room. The parish priest who guarded it was aware of some of these stories from elsewhere in the country. People mentioned them in confession or after Massachusetts. He listened, encouraged faith, and repeated the Church's teaching. Seek God first in the sacraments and in love of neighbor. If extraordinary things occur, they must lead to deeper conversion, or they are of little value. At the same time, far beyond the walls of that parish, a very different kind of preparation was underway. In foreign capitals, dossiers on Venezuela grew thicker. Intelligence services compared notes, tracing financial flows, cargo shipments, and coded messages. Public accusations of corruption, drug trafficking, and alliances with criminal organizations had already been made. Behind those accusations, investigators worked quietly, building legal cases and mapping networks of power. What ordinary Venezuelans heard were fragments. A speech here, a sanction there, rumors of international plans and operations. Life at home did not suddenly improve because of any of this. But everyone understood that something was building, pressure from outside pressing against the already unbearable pressure from within. For those who practiced their faith, the response was not to choose a side in foreign debates, but to pray more intensely. Many parishes began organizing novenas specifically for peace, for protection, and for a just resolution of the country's crisis. Rosary groups multiplied. Some made personal vows to Our Lady, promising acts of charity or sacrifices if Venezuela could be spared from greater violence. In whispered conversations, an intuition emerged among the faithful. When things reach their worst point, Mary will not remain silent. No one knew what that might look like. No one could have guessed the exact form it would take. Some imagined a great national conversion, others a miracle of unity among leaders. Almost no one imagined that the moment of Mary's most dramatic intervention, at least in the eyes of many believers, would coincide with a night of fire in the capital and the downfall of a single, very public man. The calendar moved forward, one difficult day at a time. The crisis did not vanish. Migration continued. Politics remained a battlefield of accusations and slogans. But beneath all of that, two invisible paths were converging. The visible trajectory of power, with its decisions, alliances, and inevitable consequences. And the invisible trajectory of grace, woven in decades of Marian devotion, kitchen table rosaries, and the silent gaze of a hidden statue in Caracas. Soon, these two paths would cross in a way no one could ignore. The night chosen by history for that collision would be brief in hours, but its impact would echo far beyond Venezuela's borders. By the time the calendar approached the early days of 2026, Venezuela felt like a country standing on the edge of a precipice. For most ordinary families, politics had become less a matter of ideology and more a matter of survival. They spoke less about the names and slogans on television and more about whether they could find flour, medicine, or a way to keep the lights on during yet another power cut. The inflation that once seemed shocking had become almost impossible to measure. Prices changed so fast that people learned to rush from paycheck to market within hours, before money lost even more of its value. In this environment, many hearts quietly shifted their focus. If human solutions seemed increasingly fragile, the need for a higher anchor became harder to deny. In countless homes, images of the Virgin Mary occupied places of honor: a shelf above the television, a small corner table, a framed print on a wall surrounded by candles and plastic flowers. The titles varied: Our Lady of Coromoto, Our Lady of the Rosary, Our Lady of Mount Carmel, but the intuition was the same: we cannot fix this alone. Mother, help us. Priests and religious who had served for decades noticed a change in the way people prayed. Before, many parishioners had recited the rosary as a habit passed down from their grandparents, almost like a family tradition. Now, every Hail Mary felt like a lifeline. People prayed with the urgency of someone clinging to a piece of wood in a stormy sea. At the same time, the gap between what people saw on international news and what they experienced at home grew wider. On screens, they heard about accusations, indictments, and complex geopolitical strategies. They saw foreign leaders using strong words and promising decisive actions. They listened to commentators argue over legality, sovereignty, and national interest. At home, they saw their children lose weight. They saw neighbors selling furniture, books, and even family heirlooms just to pay for a bus ticket out of the country. They watched grandparents break down in tears as another son or daughter said goodbye, heading for an uncertain life abroad. In parishes, confession lines lengthened, surprisingly not only with elderly believers, but with young adults who had drifted away from the church during more comfortable times. Many returned now, humbled by suffering, searching for a foundation that would not crumble under economic or political pressure. The hidden statue in Caracas remained in its storage room. However, she was no longer simply a forgotten object. She had become a symbol in the heart of the parish priest who visited her. Often, late at night after locking the church doors, he would go into that small room, switch on a single dim light, and stand before the wrapped figure. Gently, he would uncover her face. The carved features of the Virgin, serene and compassionate, seemed to look back at him with a calm that defied the chaos outside. He would speak to her as a son speaks to his mother. Look at your people. They are tired. They are divided. They are afraid. You know each one by name. If there is any moment when they need you visibly, it is now. Show them that you are still here. There were no audible answers, no voices from heaven, no sudden visions. Only a deep sense of being heard. A quiet conviction in his heart that the Mother of God had not abandoned Caracas or Venezuela. Far beyond that sacristy, forces of another kind had also reached a breaking point. Investigations, accusations, and press conferences abroad had created a long trail of words. Now, actions were being prepared. Plans that had been discussed behind closed doors for months began to harden into concrete decisions. Operations designed in secrecy moved from theory to execution. Most Venezuelans were unaware of the details. They did not see the briefings, the satellite images, or the intelligence reports. They did not know which plane was landing where, or which unit was being deployed. They simply felt an increase in tension, like the air before a storm, heavy and waiting to break. Some sensed it in small ways: unusual rumors circulating faster than usual, a strange quiet in certain official channels, a tone of urgency in foreign statements. Others, more attuned to spiritual signs, felt it in prayer. They could not say why, but their hearts told them, something is about to happen. In several parishes, pastors announced special days of fasting and prayer, for the nation and for peace. Rosary groups extended their meetings, adding hours of silent adoration before the Blessed Sacrament. People lit candles not only for their personal intentions, but explicitly for Venezuela and for our leaders, whatever happens. Among the faithful, an idea surfaced again and again. Perhaps God will allow a great shaking, so that we remember who we really are and who truly reigns over this land. For those who loved Mary, this thought took a very particular form. They did not imagine her arriving with swords and thunder. They imagined her doing what she always does in the Gospel, standing close to her children at their worst hour, pointing gently towards her son, and quietly interceding when the wine of human solutions runs out. In private conversations, some believers began to connect the dots between the hiddenness of the Marian image and the hiddenness of God's plan. If she has been kept out of sight for so long, they wondered, perhaps her return will not be just a small local event. Perhaps it will be a sign for the whole nation. No one guessed how literal that would become. The calendar turned. The first days of January approached, carrying with them the weight of accumulated crises and the invisible momentum of decisions made far from Venezuelan soil. The Church's liturgical year moved peacefully through Christmastide, singing of a child born in poverty and light shining in darkness. On paper, it was just another new year for a country that had already seen too many disappointments. On the level of faith, something else was happening, something deep, quiet, and unstoppable. A people battered by history had turned, almost instinctively, toward a mother they trusted more than any political promise. A hidden statue in Caracas stood as a silent witness to that trust. And far away, in places of power, a different plan was moving towards its climax. Soon, in a single night, these two currents, one spiritual, one political, would collide. And when that night ended, both the fate of a man and the spiritual imagination of millions would be changed forever. It happened in the dark hours, when most of the city should have been asleep. In the early morning of January 3rd, before dawn had even thought of touching the horizon, Caracas was shaken awake by a violence unlike anything it had seen in years. The first sounds were distant, almost indistinguishable from the usual noises of a restless capital. Then came the unmistakable echoes of explosions, sharp and heavy, rolling across the hills and into the crowded neighborhoods. Windows rattled. Car alarms screamed. Dogs barked in confusion. In the barrios that climbed the slopes around the city, families jolted out of sleep. Parents rushed to bedrooms, gathering their children, trying to decide whether to stay inside, to hide in a hallway, or to move to an interior room away from windows. Electricity flickered in some areas, failed in others, leaving entire blocks lit only by the red-orange flashes on the horizon. From balconies and rooftops, those brave or desperate enough to look could see the sky over central Caracas intermittently glowing with a dull flare of distant impacts. The rumble of aircraft vibrated through the cold air. The city, already tense from years of crisis, now trembled under a different kind of fear, the fear of war. Meanwhile, in a parish not far from the center, the priest who had watched over the hidden statue of Mary was still awake. He had felt a strange restlessness that night and had gone to the church to pray. When the first explosion sounded, the walls shuddered slightly. The candles on the altar trembled. For a moment, his instincts as a man told him to run, to find shelter. But his instincts as a shepherd held him in place. He went instead toward the sacristy. Opening the familiar door with shaking hands, he entered the small storage room where the large statue of the Virgin had stood for 11 years. The air smelled of dust and old wood. The light was dim. He moved toward the covered figure, intending only to say a quick prayer and then decide what to do next. What happened next would mark him forever. As he pulled back the cloth from the statue's face, expecting to see the same calm features he had seen so many times before, he noticed something different. The room, which had been lit only by a weak bulb, now seemed brighter, yet he had not touched the switch. The light did not come from above. It seemed to come from the statue itself. The carved face of Mary, usually matte and pale, appeared subtly luminous. Not harsh or blinding, but softly radiant, as if a gentle light were shining just beneath the surface of the wood. Her hands, joined in prayer, seemed to reflect the same mysterious glow. The priest blinked, wiped his eyes, and looked again. The light remained. He checked the bulb. It was the same weak lamp. He turned it off for a moment. The room darkened, but the statue did not. Even in those few seconds, her face still seemed faintly lit, as though she carried her own dawn within her. Overwhelmed, he fell to his knees. Outside, the explosions continued, punctuating the early morning with fear. Inside that small room, there was only silence and a presence he could not explain. In other parts of the city, and in several towns across the country, similar scenes unfolded. In a chapel in Maracaibo, where a small group had gathered to pray through the night, the faithful reported that their Marian image, simple and unremarkable on any other day, appeared unusually bright. They first thought it was a trick of the emergency lights, or the reflection of distant flashes in the sky. But even when they blocked those sources, the soft glow remained. In another parish, a young woman who had rushed to the church seeking refuge as the noise of aircraft filled the air stepped inside and stopped in her tracks. The sanctuary was dimly lit, but the statue of the Virgin at the side altar seemed framed by a halo of pale light, not painted, not artificial, but almost like the light before sunrise, compressed into a small space. At nearly the same time, in a different city, people praying the rosary in a darkened church suddenly smelled an intense fragrance of roses, stronger than anything they had experienced, unmistakable, and yet there were no flowers present. The scent filled the air just as the sounds of distant explosions reached their ears. These events were not coordinated. No one had planned a Marian vigil, tied to geopolitical events. These were small, scattered communities reacting to fear the only way they knew how, by going to church, by kneeling, by lighting candles, by turning to Mary. And yet, in that same window of hours, as the clock moved past midnight and toward the dawn of January 3rd, reports like these would later surface from multiple places. Statues that seemed to shine. Unexpected fragrances. A strange peace descending upon those inside churches, even as chaos threatened outside. At the macro level of history, something else was happening at the very same time. In the shadow of military aircraft and under the coordination of foreign command centers, a high-risk operation was unfolding in Caracas. The target was not a building, nor a symbolic monument, but a man, the head of state whose name had been on the lips of journalists, diplomats, and protesters for years. While families huddled in hallways, while children cried and mothers whispered prayers to Mary, specialized units moved through the darkness with precision. Their objective was clear: to seize Nicolas Maduro and end his hold on power by force, transporting him out of the country to face charges abroad. For those inside the operation, this was a mission defined by strategy, intelligence, and law. For those beneath the falling shadows of aircraft and exploding munitions, it felt like Judgment Day. For those in the churches, it felt like something else entirely, a night when heaven refused to stand far away. Inside the storage room in Caracas, the priest remained on his knees. As the distant thunder of conflict continued, he found himself speaking to the luminous statue almost without thinking. "Mother, if ever this people needed you, it is tonight. If ever this nation needed your protection and your intercession, it is in these hours. Stay with us. Stay with Venezuela." He felt no voice in response, no audible answer. Only a profound interior certainty that the mother he had asked to return was, in some mysterious way, already here, standing in the very moment when his nation was being shaken to its core. Outside, the operation moved toward its climax. The collision of these two realities, a hidden, radiant statue and a public, explosive intervention against a sitting leader, was not yet visible to the world. But in the logic of faith, something decisive had begun. By the time the first gray light of morning would begin to creep over the mountains around Caracas, the course of the country's political story would be radically altered. And in the hearts of many Venezuelan Catholics, the memory of a night when images of Mary seemed to shine in the dark would never be forgotten. When dawn finally began to wash a pale gray light over Caracas on January 3rd, the city looked and felt different. Smoke still curled up from distant neighborhoods. Streets that were usually noisy and chaotic at that hour remained strangely quiet. People emerged slowly from their homes, cautious, eyes scanning the sky and the horizon, trying to understand what had happened in the night. Phones buzzed with messages and breaking alerts. Social media, patchy and unstable, nevertheless carried the same shocking words from many different directions. He's been taken. They captured him. Maduro is no longer in the country. Within hours, television and online broadcasts confirmed what rumors had already spread. A foreign operation had struck Caracas and other key locations, and Nicolas Maduro, along with his wife, had been seized and transported out of Venezuela to face charges abroad. Images began to circulate of him handcuffed, guarded by heavily armed officers, being moved under tight security. For years, Venezuelans had heard threats, promises, and speculation about drastic changes. Many had stopped believing that anything decisive would ever happen. Now, in a single morning, they were confronted with the reality that the man whose face had dominated newspapers, billboards, and speeches was suddenly gone. Reactions varied wildly. Some felt a surge of relief, hoping this might be the end of a long period of suffering. Others felt fear, worried about retaliation, chaos, or the unknown power structures that might emerge. Still others felt anger, at the method, at the foreign involvement, at the sense that their country's fate had been decided by forces they did not control. Over all of this, one feeling hovered like a question hanging in the air. What happens now? In the parish where the hidden statue had shone in the night, the priest knew that people would soon come seeking more than political analysis. They would come seeking meaning, comfort, and a place to bring their confusion and their pain. Before opening the main doors of the church, he went once more to the small storage room. The mysterious glow that had surrounded the statue during the night was no longer visible. In the clear light of morning, she looked as she always had: carved wood, painted features, serene expression. But something had changed in him. The events of the night, combined with the news of the morning, left him with a conviction that could no longer be contained in a locked room. For 11 years, this image, so dear to generations of faithful, had been kept out of sight, hidden for reasons of prudence and security. Now, at the very moment when the entire nation stood at a crossroads, he sensed that it was time for the mother to stand in the open again. Quietly, he called a few parish volunteers who lived nearby. Together, they carefully lifted the statue, unwrapped it completely, and carried it toward the main church. The building was still empty. The city outside was still in shock. But inside, something profoundly symbolic was about to happen. They placed the large image of Mary at the front of the sanctuary, in full view of the empty pews, where any person walking in would see her immediately. Her hands were joined in prayer. Her eyes, carved slightly downward, seemed to rest gently on the entrance doors. The priest switched on the lights and opened the main doors. It did not take long. Within minutes, parishioners began to arrive, some alone, some in small groups, some with children in tow. They came with questions on their lips and anxiety in their hearts. But when they stepped inside and saw her, saw the statue that many had not seen in more than a decade, something shifted. A woman in her 50s, who had once carried this very image in processions through the streets when she was young, stopped in the doorway and covered her mouth with her hand. Tears filled her eyes. "She's back," she whispered. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. "The statue is out again. They brought her back. After all these years, she's in the church again." Soon, the church was no longer empty. People filled the pews, knelt in the aisles, gathered at the back. Some had come to process the shocking political news. They found instead a mother standing quietly at the center of the sanctuary. The priest did not give a fiery political homily. He did not analyze the legality of international operations or the details of indictments. Instead, he spoke simply about Mary. He reminded the congregation that, throughout history, when nations passed through times of upheaval, wars, collapses, regime changes, believers had turned to the Blessed Virgin not as a politician, but as a mother. A mother who stands close at the foot of every cross her children must bear. A mother who does not erase suffering with magic, but offers presence, intercession, and hope. He invited them to do one thing that morning: to place at the feet of the Virgin both their fears and their desires for the future of the country. Outside, as the day advanced, More and more details emerged about the operation, about the charges awaiting Maduro abroad, and about the emergency political arrangements now forming inside Venezuela. International reactions poured in, condemnations, celebrations, warnings, and strategic calculations. But inside the churches, especially those where Marian images had shone or where the fragrance of roses had filled the air just hours before, a different kind of reaction was taking place. People who had not entered a church in years returned, drawn by something they could not fully articulate. Some came angry, some came skeptical, some came only to see if it was true that the old image had been put back. Many stayed longer than they expected, sitting in silence before Mary, letting the noise of breaking news fade into the background. Children, who had only ever seen this large statue in old photos or in the stories of their grandparents, now saw her with their own eyes. For them, this was not only a religious moment, it was a reclaiming of memory, a connection to something in Venezuela's identity that had been missing from the public eye for more than a decade. By midday, images of crowded churches and long lines of people waiting to enter Marian shrines began to circulate online and on television. Observers abroad, accustomed to seeing Venezuela only in the context of protests, shortages, and political confrontation, were surprised by these new scenes. Men and women of every age and social class kneeling together before an image of the Virgin Mary. Commentators tried to interpret it. Was it a protest? A sign of approval or disapproval of what had happened? A political statement? For the people on their knees, it was something simpler and deeper. It was a collective instinct. When everything around us changes in one night, we go to the one who does not change. In that sense, what shocked the world that day was not only the fate of one man taken away in handcuffs, but the sight of an entire nation turning, not to revenge, not to immediate triumphalism, but to prayer. The fall of a leader had exposed, in a raw and undeniable way, the fragility of human power. The return of a mother to the center of the church exposed something else, a spiritual strength that had survived 11 years in hiding, and was now, finally, standing in the light again. What began in one parish in Caracas on the morning of January 3rd quickly spread across Venezuela. As news of the sudden fall and removal of Nicolas Maduro circulated, another kind of news traveled along quieter channels. In many churches, long-hidden statues of the Virgin Mary were being brought back into the light. Priests who had kept Marian images in side chapels or storerooms for years now placed them at the very center of their sanctuaries. In Maracaibo, a pastor who had sensed the mysterious scent of roses during the night placed his parish's statue of Our Lady in front of the altar and simply announced that the church would remain open. Within a short time, the benches were filled. People arrived with many different emotions: relief, fear, confusion, but all of them knelt before the same mother. In Valencia, an old processional statue that had not been seen publicly for more than a decade was carried out and set near the main doors of the church. Passers-by stopped, crossed themselves, and entered. Some stayed only a few minutes, lighting a candle and whispering a Hail Mary. Others remained for hours in silent prayer. At the national shrine of Our Lady of Coromoto, the number of pilgrims grew rapidly. Some had planned their visits long before. Others decided almost impulsively, if something so big is happening to our country, we must go to our mother. They came on crowded buses, on motorcycles, and on foot, carrying backpacks, water, and worn rosaries. What struck many observers, both inside and outside the country, was the tone of these gatherings. They were not celebrations of the downfall of a man. They were not partisan demonstrations disguised as prayer. They were moments of collective entrustment. Everywhere, people prayed for peace, for justice without hatred, for protection from further violence, and for the conversion of hearts. Instead of shouting slogans, they prayed the rosary. Instead of waving flags, they carried candles and small images of Mary. Inside families, quiet changes began to surface. Relatives who had stopped speaking to each other over political disagreements now found themselves side by side in the same pew. The intensity of the crisis and the dramatic events of the night made their long-standing quarrels seem suddenly small. In front of the Virgin, it became easier to say, "I'm tired of fighting. Let's ask her to help us start again." In confessionals, priests heard words of surrender and reconciliation. "I don't want to hate anymore. I want to forgive. I want to begin a new life." The fall of a political figure had revealed not only the fragility of institutions, but also the weariness of hearts that had carried resentment for too long. Images from these days began to appear in international media. Viewers who were used to seeing Venezuela only in the context of protests, shortages, and harsh political speeches now saw something different. Long lines of people entering churches, processions with Marian statues through damaged streets, crowds praying out loud in front of sanctuaries. Analysts tried to explain it in many ways, but for believers the meaning was simple. For 11 years, Marian devotion had been pressured into the background, pushed into houses and quiet chapels. Now, at the precise moment when the country's political story took a dramatic turn, Mary had returned to the center. In the parish where the hidden statue had been unveiled, the priest watched his people with a mixture of awe and responsibility. He understood that this was not a time for emotional manipulation or easy promises. It was a time to teach. In homilies and catechesis, he and many other priests across the country repeated a key point. Mary is not a political weapon, nor a replacement for human responsibility. She is a mother who leads her children back to God. She invites them to conversion, to forgiveness, to works of mercy, and to a deeper trust in Christ. Many young Venezuelans, who had grown up in the midst of crisis and had learned to distrust nearly all authorities, were struck by the sight of their parents and grandparents praying with such intensity. For some, this awakened a new curiosity about the faith they had considered merely cultural. For others, it became the beginning of a personal return to God. In the space of just a few days after January 3rd, a quiet but powerful shift occurred. 4 years, the public space had been dominated by the image and voice of a single leader. Now, the most compelling images were those of a woman carved in wood or painted on canvas, a mother surrounded by candles, tears, and whispered prayers. The political consequences of Maduro's capture would continue to unfold in courts and diplomatic circles. But within Venezuela, another consequence was already visible. A nation rediscovering, in the figure of Mary, a path toward unity, healing, and hope that no operation, no government, and no crisis had been able to erase. In the days immediately following January 3rd, the eyes of the world remained fixed on the political drama. News outlets replayed the same images again and again. Nicolas Maduro, once the uncontested figure at the center of Venezuelan power, now handcuffed, escorted by armed officers, transferred under heavy guard to face charges in a foreign court. Analysts discussed in detail the operation that had removed him, the legal accusations, and the international implications. But slowly, almost reluctantly, global media began to notice something they had not expected to cover. Alongside footage of soldiers and helicopters, new images appeared. Endless lines of people entering churches. Large statues of the Virgin Mary carried through crowded streets. Entire plazas illuminated at night only by candles, as thousands prayed the rosary out loud. 4 years, headlines about Venezuela had been dominated by the language of collapse, economic, political, and social. Now, journalists found themselves using a different vocabulary, words like pilgrimage, devotion, and spiritual awakening. Interviewers who came to film reactions to Maduro's capture discovered that many Venezuelans preferred to talk instead about something else, the return of Mary to the center of their public life. A reporter asked a woman in front of a church, "What do you think about what happened to the president?" She answered, "Whatever happens to any leader, they come and go. What really matters to me today is that Our Lady is out here again. I'm praying for my country, for him, and for everyone. We all need mercy." For some international observers, this was the most surprising part. They expected anger, vindication, maybe even revenge. They found instead a people kneeling, asking God to heal the wounds of the entire nation, including those caused by the very man now standing before foreign judges. Commentators debated whether this Marian resurgence would have lasting effects or whether it was only a passing emotional response to a historic shock. But on the ground, among Venezuelans themselves, there was a quieter, more personal question taking root. What kind of country do we want to become, now that the man who ruled us is gone and our mother is, once again, in full view? In homes, schools, and parish halls, the answer often began with the same idea. A country where faith is not an ornament, but a compass. Catechists used the events of those days as a living lesson. They explained to children and teenagers that power without justice eventually collapses, that no human leader is permanent, and that true greatness in the gospel is measured not by control, but by service and love. They pointed to Mary as the opposite of the logic of domination. She did not seize power. She said yes to God in humility. She did not flee from suffering. She stood at the foot of the cross. She did not demand revenge. She prayed in silence with the disciples, waiting for the coming of the Spirit. The shock, for many who watched from outside Venezuela, was not merely that Maduro had been captured and removed. History had seen that pattern before with other leaders in other nations. The deeper shock was this. At the very moment when a story of raw power reached its apparent climax, another story, much older and more enduring, rose visibly to the surface. For 11 years, an image of the Virgin Mary had been effectively banned from public prominence, confined to hidden spaces in the name of security and order. Now, in the wake of the dramatic fall of the man who had presided over those years, this same mother was carried through the streets amid tears, songs, and the fragile hope of a wounded people. In the spiritual imagination of Venezuelan Catholics, this overlap of events took on a clear meaning. The man who had seemed untouchable, who appeared on every official wall and whose voice had filled the airwaves, was now small, just another defendant in a courtroom far from home. The woman who had been kept in the shadows, whose image had been wrapped and stored away, was now central. Her face on viral images of processions, her name on the lips of millions praying for their country. What shocked the world, then, was not only the fall of a president, but the way a nation responded, not with a new cult of personality, but with a renewed turning toward a mother and, through her, toward God. In the years to come, experts would analyze the legal consequences of the operation, the geopolitical calculations behind it, and the economic reconstruction that followed. But in the hearts of countless Venezuelans, the memory that mattered most would be simpler and more intimate. The night when, as bombs fell and aircraft roared, statues of Mary seemed to shine in dark churches. The morning when a hidden image, stored away for 11 years, was carried back into the light. And the days when, instead of choosing revenge, a people chose to kneel together and ask the Virgin to help them become better than their past. For believers, this was not a coincidence, but a providential lesson written in the language of history. Earthly leaders rise and fall. Human empires come and go. But the mother who never abandons her children, especially in their darkest hours, remains. And for a watching world, accustomed to seeing faith dismissed as irrelevant in modern politics, this visible, powerful Marian response from a wounded nation was, indeed, something unexpected. It was a reminder that behind every headline about power, there is a deeper story. The story of souls, of conscience, of prayer. And that sometimes, the true shock in history is not what happens to a ruler, but how a people chooses to respond under the gaze of heaven.